When Americans think about Ireland, they get the version the Empire wanted them to have. Leprechauns and green beer, a drunk uncle at a wedding, a small wet island that exports nothing but writers and bartenders. That picture was assembled deliberately, over centuries, by the country next door, and it describes a place that has never existed. Ireland is a 5,000-year-old civilization that mapped the winter solstice with stone tools, while the Egyptians were still cutting their first pyramid blocks. Irish monks kept European literacy alive while Rome burned. And when the English arrived in 1169 with plans to absorb the place, they ran into something they could not solve for 800 years, a country that refused to forget who it was, even after 1 million of its people had been starved to death in the presence of full-grain ships, even after its language was made illegal by Act of Parliament, even after a 26-year-old poet was tied to a chair in Kilmainham jail and shot because he could not stand on the leg the British had already shattered. The empire that did all of that to Ireland doesn't exist anymore. Ireland is still here, still speaking the language, still running the parliament, still writing the songs. This is how that happened. The British arrived in Ireland in 1169. Ireland had already been a continuous civilization for 5,200 years before that knock at the door. Newgrange, in County Meath, is a passage tomb older than Stonehenge and older than the Great Pyramid of Giza. It was built around 3,200 BC by people who had already mapped the winter solstice with such precision that for 1 hour every year on December 21st, sunlight enters a roof box and travels 19 meters down a stone corridor to illuminate the central chamber. They built that 5,200 years ago. Most modern engineers cannot tell you how. By the 5th century AD, Ireland had a written legal code called the Penal Laws, a system that gave women property rights, divorce rights, and inheritance rights that the rest of Europe would not match for another 1,000 years. It had a monastic civilization so dense and so literate that when the Western Roman Empire collapsed and Europe lost most of its written knowledge, Irish monks at places like Clonmacnoise and Skellig Michael copied and preserved the texts that Europe would later need to rebuild itself with. Historians call this period the reason Ireland saved civilization. Ireland was called the Island of Saints and Scholars. It was sending missionaries to convert the rest of Europe. It had its own kings, its own poets, its own legal scholars, its own currency in the form of cattle, its own high king at the Hill of Tara. Then a Norman knight named Richard de Clare landed at Bannow Bay in May 1169, invited by a deposed Irish king who wanted help reclaiming a throne. He brought 600 men and a quiet plan to keep the country. Richard de Clare went by a nickname his Welsh archers gave him, Strongbow. By 1171, he had married the daughter of the Irish king who invited him in, and when that king died, Strongbow inherited a kingdom by Norman law. By 1175, the King of England, Henry II, had crossed the sea himself to make sure no Norman lord set up an independent Irish kingdom outside his control. This is when 800 years begins. The English never fully conquered Ireland in those first centuries. They controlled a small fortified zone around Dublin called the Pale, origin of the phrase "beyond the Pale," meaning anywhere the English writ did not run. Outside the Pale, Irish chieftains kept ruling in Irish, kept practicing Brehon law, kept ignoring London. Many of the Norman families who settled Ireland eventually went native, adopting the language, marrying into Irish clans, becoming more Irish than the Irish themselves. That casual coexistence ended in 1534. Henry VIII broke from the Catholic Church to divorce Catherine of Aragon, declared himself the head of a new Church of England, and immediately had a problem. Ireland was Catholic. Ireland would not stop being Catholic, and a Catholic Ireland sitting on England's western flank was now a national security threat. In 1541, Henry declared himself King of Ireland, the first English monarch to claim the title, and the policy of plantation began. Plantation meant taking the land of Irish Catholic families and giving it to English and Scottish Protestant settlers. Munster Plantation, 1580s, Ulster Plantation, 1610. By the time Oliver Cromwell arrived in 1649, the policy was 60 years old, and the country was already a powder keg. What Cromwell did to Ireland in the next 4 years would kill a higher percentage of the population than any war Europe had ever recorded, including the Black Death of 3 centuries earlier. And it would be remembered in Irish memory not as ancient history, but as a wound the country still carries the scar of in 2026. Oliver Cromwell landed in Dublin in August 1649. He was a Puritan who believed Catholics were enemies of God, and he had an army of 12,000 hardened English soldiers and a free hand from a parliament that had just executed its own king. At Drogheda in September 1649, Cromwell's men killed almost the entire garrison and a large number of civilians, somewhere between 2,000 and 3,500 dead in a single day. The town's defenders had agreed terms of surrender. Cromwell ignored them. At Wexford a month later, he did it again. By the time the campaign ended in 1653, the population of Ireland had fallen from roughly 1.5 million to under 850,000. War, famine, and plague combined to kill or banish 41% of the country. Cromwell's Parliament then passed the Act for the Settlement of Ireland in 1652. Catholic landowners across most of the island had their land seized. They were given a choice: death, transportation as indentured labor to the West Indies, or relocation to the rocky western province of Connaught. The phrase the Irish remembered was, "to hell or to Connaught." Around 50,000 Irish Catholics were shipped to Barbados as effective slaves. Connaught filled up with the dispossessed. It got worse. From 1695, the English Parliament began passing what became known as the Penal Laws. Under these statutes, a Catholic in Ireland could not vote, could not sit in Parliament, could not hold public office, could not practice law, could not buy land, could not own a horse worth more than £5, could not send a child abroad to be educated, and could not openly practice their religion. Catholic priests were hunted. Catholic Mass was held in fields, beside hidden boulders called Mass Rocks, by candlelight. Possessing a Bible in Irish was a crime. A foreign government had made it illegal to be Irish in Ireland, and it stayed that way, in various forms, for nearly 150 years. By the 1790s, the American colonies had broken free of Britain. Revolutionary France had executed its king. The smell of independence was in the European air, and in Belfast, of all places, a young Protestant lawyer named Theobald Wolfe Tone founded the Society of United Irishmen in 1791 with one stated purpose: to unite Catholic, Protestant, and Dissenter Irish under a single national identity and break the tie with Britain forever. Tone was a Protestant. Most of his founding committee was Protestant. The argument they were making was not religious. It was that the Irish, all of them, were a nation, and Britain was a foreign power, and that arithmetic mattered more than which church anyone attended on Sunday. The 1798 rebellion was the result. It started in Wexford in May. By June, French ships were trying to land an invasion force at Killala Bay to support it. By autumn, it was over. Around 30,000 Irish people had died. Wolfe Tone was captured aboard a French frigate in November 1798, court-martialed, and sentenced to be hanged. He cut his own throat in his cell with a penknife rather than let the British hang him. The British response to the rebellion was the Act of Union of 1800. The Irish Parliament, which had existed in some form since the 13th century, was abolished. Ireland was absorbed directly into the United Kingdom. The country lost its government completely. But Wolfe Tone had planted something. The idea that Ireland was a nation, not a faith, began to outlive everyone who said it. In September 1845, Irish farmers noticed something strange in their potato fields. The leaves had turned black. When they dug up the tubers, the potatoes had liquefied into foul-smelling rot in the ground. A microscopic fungus called Phytophthora infestans had crossed the Atlantic from North America, and by 1846 it had destroyed more than 3/4 of the entire Irish potato crop. Around 3 million Irish people, almost half the population, depended on the potato as their entire daily food source. They starved. What history books often leave out is that Ireland during the famine years was a net exporter of food. Wheat, oats, barley, beef, butter, eggs, and pork were leaving Irish ports under armed guard while Irish people died of hunger on the docks watching the ships sail. Charles Trevelyan, the British civil servant in charge of relief, wrote that the famine was the judgment of God on an indolent and unself-reliant people, and that interfering with market forces would be a moral error worse than the deaths themselves. Soup kitchens were closed. Public works programs were ended. Workhouses were the only relief offered, and entering one cost you whatever land you still had. Between 1845 and 1852, around 1 million Irish people died of starvation and disease. 2 million more emigrated, most of them on coffin ships across the Atlantic, where another fifth would die before reaching New York, Boston, or Quebec. The population of Ireland in 1841 was 8.4 million, and by 1851 it had fallen below 6.6 million. By 1900, it was 4.5 million. The country lost nearly half its people in 50 years and has never recovered to its pre-famine numbers in the 175 years since. The Irish word for what happened is An Gorta Mór, the Great Hunger. They never call it the Great Famine, and the difference is the whole story. A famine is something the weather does. A hunger is something a government does, while there is food in the storehouses, while the ships are still sailing, while the next country over is eating Irish butter on its bread. You cannot kill a country like Ireland with a famine and expect it to forget. While the British government was deciding that the Irish were beyond saving, ordinary Irish people were already working on the long answer. Hedge schools had been operating illegally since the Penal Laws began. Catholic teachers, paid in eggs or a few pennies a week, taught children Latin, Greek, mathematics, and Irish history in fields, in barns, and behind stone walls. By 1830, the British finally permitted national schools, but they were taught only in English, and children caught speaking Irish were forced to wear a wooden tally stick called a butter scoir around their necks. A notch was cut into it for every Irish word spoken. The notches were used to calculate beatings at the end of the day. In 1893, a Protestant Trinity College graduate named Douglas Hyde co-founded the Gaelic League with one goal: to revive the Irish language before it died. Hyde was the son of a Church of Ireland clergyman, and he spent his life learning Irish from elderly speakers in Roscommon. He would later become the first president of Ireland in 1938. In 1899, William Butler Yeats and Lady Gregory founded what became the Abbey Theatre in Dublin, taking Irish folklore, Irish myth, Irish landscapes, and Irish speech rhythms, and putting them on a stage in front of the country that had been told for 2 centuries that it had no culture worth preserving. Patrick Pearse, who would die for an Irish Republic 17 years later, spent his teenage years writing for the Gaelic League newspaper in Irish. The Empire watched all of this and saw nostalgic old men collecting dying songs. What was actually happening in those parlor rooms and theater rehearsals was a generation building the cultural ammunition for the rebellion that came in 1916. On Easter Monday, April 24, 1916, around 1,200 men and women of the Irish Volunteers and the Irish Citizen Army seized strategic buildings across central Dublin. Patrick Pearse, a 36-year-old schoolteacher and poet, stood on the steps of the General Post Office on O'Connell Street and read a proclamation declaring an Irish Republic. The British responded by shelling the city centre for 6 days. By Saturday, the rising was over. 485 people lay dead in the streets. The rising was unpopular at first. Dubliners booed the volunteers as they were marched to ships bound for prison camps in Wales. And then the British did the worst thing they could have done. between May 3rd and May 12th, the leaders of the rising were court-martialed and shot in the stone-breaking yard of Kilmainham Jail. Pearce was shot first. James Connolly, the Labour organiser who had been wounded in the fighting, could not stand. The British tied him to a chair and shot him sitting down. Within months, the men the British executed were martyrs. Within 2 years, Sinn Féin, the political party associated with the rising, won 73 of Ireland's 105 parliamentary seats and refused to take them. Within 3 years, an Irish Republican army under the command of a 28-year-old named Michael Collins was running a guerrilla war against British forces across Ireland. Within 5 years, the Anglo-Irish Treaty of December 1921 had created the Irish Free State, and 26 of the country's 32 counties were no longer part of the United Kingdom. The other 6 counties, partitioned to remain in the UK as Northern Ireland, would carry on the war for another 70 years. Civil war in the south followed. Collins himself was assassinated by Irish Republicans who refused to accept partition. The cost of independence was paid in blood, and most of it was Irish blood spilled by Irish hands. But the empire was gone from 80% of the island, and it was never coming back. Ireland today, both jurisdictions counted together, has a population of around 7 million people, still less than it was the year before the famine began. The Republic of Ireland is one of the wealthiest nations in Europe per capita, and its capital is the European headquarters of half the world's largest tech companies. Northern Ireland's worst years of the Troubles ended with the Good Friday Agreement of 1998, signed in Belfast by a British Prime Minister, an Irish Prime Minister, and Northern Irish leaders from both communities. The killing has not entirely stopped, but it has mostly stopped, and the border that partition drew in 1921 is now mostly an unmarked line through fields where cows graze across 2 jurisdictions without noticing. The Irish language, the one the British spent 2 centuries trying to extinguish, is now an official working language of the European Union. Around 1.7 million people on the island say they can speak it. Schools in the Republic teach in it. The state broadcaster runs an Irish language television station. And the diaspora the famine forced across the Atlantic now numbers somewhere between 30 and 40 million people in the United States alone, 5 times the population of the country itself. Ireland has produced 4 Nobel Prize winners in literature from a country of 7 million. The British Empire produced 10 from a population 15 times that size. By the per capita math, the country the British called culturally inferior has outwritten its colonizer by a factor of nearly 3 to 1. The British Empire is gone. It rules no continents and no oceans now. It is a memory, a set of museum exhibits, an unresolved argument about Elgin marbles and Koh-i-Noor diamonds. Ireland is still here, still speaking the language, still telling the story. The empire that tried to erase the Irish is now smaller than the diaspora the Irish built across the world it tried to lock them out of. The Irish do not care about your opinion of them. They never did. That is the whole answer. If you want more hidden history like this, do well to subscribe to this channel and tell me in the comments which country you want uncovered next. As always, we'll see you in the past.